right. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Manic Mercurian, and today we're going to talk about generations. We're going to talk about generational astrology. I'm, of course, not covering all the generations here. We're just going to be focusing on the generations between 1971 and 2008, those that are born between 1971 and 2008, that is. And just to give you a little bit of background before we start the video, recently my life has changed a lot. I'm currently working a job that is very physical in nature. There's not much, mental to it. I'm throwing like lumber. I work at a lumber mill now. So it allows my mind to wander, and I just kind of zone out as I'm doing this very physical job. And so things come to me, when my mind is relaxed like that. And one thing that came to me was a set of tasks, 2 tasks, one of which was to talk about the planets in astrology and why their energies are the way they are. I just did that video recently. And the other sort of assignment was to talk about generational astrology. And really my intention here is honestly kind of selfish. I would like to cover this kind of series. I think it's going to be one video, but in a way it's a series of topics, series of generations. I'd like to cover these because I'm personally interested in generational astrology. You can know about someone just by knowing someone's age or the year that they were born in. Same thing, right? But just by knowing that little piece of information, you can already know where the outer planets were when they were born, and maybe, where the south node and the north node were as well. And so really there's a lot of information. Of course, it should go without saying that, within each generation, within each year, you have many different personalities that come from that same time period. Even twins will have sometimes dramatically different personalities, but there are these background themes that are consistent. And so that's where, again, even just by knowing someone's age or the year that they were born, you can already know certain themes and patterns that they will sort of fall into the umbrella of, if that makes sense. And some people will relate much more to their generational astrology than other people. It just depends on their natal placements. Like, for instance, the chart I'm showing you now is for October 1971, and this is going to be the first chart that we talk about, the first generation. And so, for instance, here we have Pluto in Libra, Neptune in Sagittarius, Uranus in Libra. There's a lot going on in Libra. So for someone born specifically in October of 1971, they would probably very much relate to their generation because basically they have inner solar system placements lining up with outer solar system placements, if that makes sense. That's not going to be true for everyone. For instance, someone born maybe a month later who has Scorpio sun, that's going to be it's not going to really jive with the outer planets, which are more focused on Libra and Sagittarius. I hope that makes sense. I'm basically just explaining. Some of us relate a lot more to our generation, to our peers, than others. It's all about generalization, but still, this is worth talking about. This video is focused mostly on millennials. We're going to talk about some of the younger Generation X. We'll go through all the millennials, and we'll talk about some of the older Gen Zs as well. And depending on how this video does, if you guys are interested, or I know most of my viewers are millennials, that's why I'm doing this kind of focus. But I would definitely be happy to cover maybe older generations, like the older Gen X and the boomers, or we could even go into younger or even future generations as well. I can totally apply this same kind of technique to any generation, to any year. It could be hundreds of years ago. Of course, that wouldn't be as relevant though. And okay, basically what is this? So what it is I've kind of invented some of this terminology to the best of my ability. Most of the information here, actually, let me rephrase that. The way I've divided these generations and subgenerations, I've done this on my own, so you won't find that information anywhere else. But it is based on, the positions of the outer planets and the nodes as well. I've basically divided this period, again, people born between, let's just say 1971 to 2008. I picked those years because of where the planets were. And I've divided people born in that time period I've divided all those people basically into 6 or 7 generations, depending on how you count it. That's because one generation is kind of like a transitional, changeover generation. So I don't know if you want to count that or not. 6 or 7 generations and 20 sub-generations within those 6 or 7 generations. So that's what we're going to go through today. So I'm really excited. I have added timestamps for you so you can just skip to your generation or to whatever generation interests you personally. But if you want to go on for the whole ride with me and go through all these charts, you're more than welcome to do that as well. It's completely up to you. Okay, and let me just make sure I want to be very thorough in this. So let me make sure I've covered everything I need to cover. One question, there's a couple of questions I want to answer before we actually get into these generations. How did I decide? Basically I'm cutting off certain time periods. Like, for instance, the first subgeneration is from October 1971 to August 1973. How did I decide, where to put those marks? A different person, you could easily use completely different timestamps, timelines. You could divide these generations in a completely different way, which could be equally valid, maybe even more valid than mine. However, I did put a lot of thought into this, and there's a lot of information here. It gets very messy. There are so many different moving planets. They're all moving at different speeds. And so sometimes within a couple years, you may have many outer planets changing signs. Sometimes for many years, there are no outer planets changing signs. So that's where it does get tricky, but I did my best to divide these things in a way that makes sense. And I was going to say something else that I forgot. There's a lot of information here. This is going to be messy, but I'm going to do the best that I can. Another thing too, you will notice as we go through these subgenerations and the dates, there will be gaps between certain generations and subgenerations, and that is intentional. If you happen to be born in a time period that is a gap, I know that may not be very flattering maybe, but you can basically just use either the themes of the nearest subgeneration or combine, whatever 2 subgenerations that you're born between, you can combine the themes of those subgenerations. And that may make more sense as we get into the information. All right, so last thing before we actually get into the generations and the themes that those generations are experiencing. What is this based on? What placements? So basically it's the nodes and then all of the outer planets, starting with Jupiter, going outward away from the sun in our solar system. So for each subgeneration, we're going to talk about the placements of the nodes. The south node in particular is a big deal. It's often overlooked in astrology, but because it changes every year and a half or so, it's a great indicator for what kind of themes a subgeneration is experiencing. And I would even weight the south node as more influential than Jupiter or these other kind of planets. The south node, it just has so much to do with personality. So I'll talk about that as we go through, and you'll understand if you don't already. But we'll also talk about Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as well. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are the outermost planets. They're much slower, and so those more have to do with the generations rather than the subgenerations, if that makes sense. The subgenerations are mostly determined and kind of influenced by the nodes and Jupiter. Jupiter changes once every year or 13 months. And Saturn's kind of in between. Saturn changes signs every 2.5 years, so that's another great indicator for a subgeneration as well. Okay, hopefully I've covered everything. Otherwise, let's get into it. So I invented names for these. I know this is so nerdy. We're gonna really nerd out tonight. I put a lot of thought into this, and I've had some rum and Red Bulls. And yeah, okay. So what are the names? So the first generation we're going to talk about is, I call them the Romantics. The Romantics have Uranus in Libra, Neptune in Sagittarius, and Pluto in Libra. There's a lot of focus on Libra and Sagittarius. So what do you get when you combine Libra and Sagittarius? This is a romantic generation. It's a hopeful generation. They're very socially oriented, socially intelligent. And there's an optimism here. Both Libra and Sagittarius are ruled by benefics. Venus rules Libra, Jupiter rules Sagittarius. The first subgeneration that we will talk about also has Jupiter in Sagittarius, where it's at home. So the romantic generation occupies the time period between October 1971 and June 1975. And I've divided the romantic generation into two subgenerations. The first subgeneration occupies the time period between October 1971 and August 1973, and I call them the hopeful romantics, because they not only have Uranus in Libra, Neptune in Sagittarius, Pluto in Libra, but again, kind of like I mentioned, they also have Jupiter in Sagittarius. Some of them toward the end of this time period will have Jupiter in Capricorn or maybe even Aquarius as well. But still, there's a lot of very hopeful, very optimistic themes here. Saturn is in Gemini for these people, so they will struggle with socializing at a young age, but this will get much better over time. So especially, once they get into their 30s, 40s, 50s, etc., I would think this would be a very sociable generation, very warm, definitely very intellectual as well. What else? Let's just run through all the placements. So we mentioned Pluto Libra, Neptune Sagittarius, Uranus in Libra as well. And Saturn is in Gemini. We talked about that. Jupiter in Sagittarius. South Node will either be in Leo or Cancer, depending on, South Node. The nodes always move retrograde, by the way. So, very contrary to the planets, the nodes are always moving backward. So South Node in Leo for this early part of the subgeneration, and in Cancer for the later part. So this is another reason why I think this is a very hopeful, very romantic generation. South Node in Leo. This is kind of a Leo/Cancer. There's a lot of warmth, a lot of emotion. These people, they're warm, they're intellectual. This looks like great party energy as well. They love a good party. In general, these generational placements start out very warm. Another cycle we can talk about is the Pluto cycle. Pluto was in the kind of summer signs, more for the boomers, I would say. Pluto, roughly, this is going to be a really crude rendition, but basically Pluto was in Cancer for much of the kind of early 40s, and Pluto was in Leo for some of the 50s. Pluto was more so in Virgo in kind of like the late 60s. So that was more of like the summer period. Cancer, Leo, Virgo, 40s, 50s, 60s, summer, if that makes sense. Summer vibes. So that's why this is more, the romantics are more kind of the early part of fall, if that makes sense. Particularly these hopeful romantics, October 1971 to 1973. The 70s are kind of like a fall period. There's a little bit of Sagittarius, but a lot of Libra. This is like that first phase of fall that's really romantic, intellectual. You can kind of think of like September vibes that are coloring this entire subgeneration, if that makes sense. Things will get darker later on. We will get there. That's a good segue. The next subgeneration. So we're still within the romantic generation, but now we're moving on to the next subgeneration. This subgeneration occupies the period between November 1973 and June 1975. So you might notice there was a slight gap there, but again, you can just take into the themes of the nearest period or blend the two. Like I said, these cycles are messy, so I did the best I could. Okay, November 1973 to June 1975. I call these the lonely romantics. We still have a lot of those good romantic vibes with, Pluto Libra, Neptune Sagittarius, Uranus Libra. That continues, that's why this is the romantic generation. The reason why this is the lonely subgeneration, though, is because Jupiter is no longer, in domicile or anything like that. Jupiter is now in Aquarius, Pisces, Aries for these, few years. But mainly Saturn is in Cancer, though, and this is it's one of the most difficult Saturn placements to have, maybe the most difficult. This subgeneration, they're still within the general time period of, romance and warmth. Much of what I just said for the last generation still applies for the last subgeneration. The difference, though, is that with Saturn and Cancer, this subgeneration has issues with home and family. these people grow up not really knowing family. They, even if they had a family, they didn't have that feeling of family. They didn't have a place where they could be themselves and just relax and be open and be emotionally vulnerable. They grew up lacking all of those things. And so again, even though the broader period is very warm and, very good vibes with Libra and Sagittarius, party energy, blah, 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 Saturn and Cancer is a different part of this kind of story that these people have that is much more difficult. So that's why it's still romantic, but it's lonely romantic. It'll take time for these people to build their own families. They have the potential to be leaders of their family, to create their own family, but it's going to take a lot of time to do so. Okay, that ends the romantic generation. Now we are starting what I call the autumn generation, and that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. There's this general... Because for most of the late 1990s, these three outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, are all roughly close. That continues kind of in the early 2000s as well. But because they're all roughly close, that's why we can really kind of attribute like these seasonal qualities to these phases, these generations, these time periods. So yeah, I call this the autumn generation because this is characterized by Uranus in Scorpio, Neptune in Sagittarius, and Pluto in Libra. So all three of the outer planets are in different signs here, but they're all in fall signs. So that's the name I thought of. I don't know. But the autumn generation, I've divided it into 3 sub-generations, and the autumn generation occupies the period between September 1975 and November 1981. So late 70s, very early 80s. Okay, so the first sub-generation within the autumn generation is, I call them the stubborn autumn sub-generation. And that's because, in addition to Pluto and Libra, Neptune and Sagittarius, Uranus, which has just recently entered Scorpio, there's a lot of there's a lot of Aries and Taurus placements going on for them. They, depending on exactly when individuals fall within the subgeneration, they will either have South Node in Taurus or South Node in Aries, Jupiter either in Aries or Taurus, and they might even have Jupiter conjunct the South Node as well. So whether these placements are in Aries or Taurus, there's a lot of kind of individuality here, and as I say, stubbornness. These people are very forthright. They know themselves. Many of them, actually, I think all of them also have Saturn in Leo as well. So these people, they will start out really questioning themselves when they're young. They may have a lot of self-doubt. They may kind of just feel very down on themselves. They may be depressed at a young age. But they have the potential for building an excellent sense of self later in life. It takes time, though. Saturn in Leo is also a very difficult Saturn placement. So yeah, but these people are resilient. There's so much fixed energy here. Aries as well, so there's a lot of this is a strong-willed generation. Okay. They know what they want. They know what they don't want. Again, as I already said, this should go without saying, but these are generalizations. But generally speaking, these people know what they want. Another kind of interesting factor here is that because Uranus has just entered Scorpio and Saturn has entered Leo, many of these people have Saturn and Uranus squaring one another. Should be able to see that here. So at the very start of this, Saturn is still at 29 Cancer, Uranus is at 0 Scorpio. So technically, even by halfway through September 1975, there's an out-of-sign square between Saturn and Uranus. So there's a lot of friction here. These people are intense. This looks like an intense subgeneration. So stubborn autumn. There still are those autumn qualities of, intellectual, romantic, very sociable, kind of in a way, I guess, reminiscent of the romantic generation. But the difference is there's a certain tenacity here. There's a certain strong-willedness that is kind of new, I think, that we haven't seen in a while for these other generations. Okay, going to the next subgeneration, this occupies the period between November 1977 and February 1980. I'm not giving exact dates because the planets take time. These planets move very slowly. Another thing I forgot to mention is that outer planets retrograde all the time. It makes it a nightmare dividing these into like neat little eras or chapters. But again, I did the best I could. So I apologize if I do miss a little period where a planet retrogrades into another sign. I apologize. But generally speaking, this should be quality information I have gathered for you. Anyway, so the subgeneration, November 1977 through February 1980. At first I called this the lucky autumn subgeneration, or the soulful autumn subgeneration. The reason why is because in addition to having Pluto in Libra, Neptune in Sagittarius, Uranus in Scorpio, they also have South Node in either Aries or Pisces, and then Jupiter in either Cancer or Leo. So either way, there's some fire and some water going on for this particular subgeneration, and with that comes a lot of soulfulness. Chiron is also newly in Taurus. I forgot to mention Chiron earlier. Chiron is going to be kind of like a back burner placement here. I will mention it from time to time. I would give it less weight than all the other placements I'm talking about, but it is worth talking about from time to time. Chiron kind of dipped into Taurus. I think it first entered Taurus during the stubborn autumn subgeneration, but now it's finally permanently in Taurus for the soulful or lucky autumn subgeneration. But yeah, there's a lot of luck that comes with South Node. South Node in Aries is a very confident placement, and South Node in Pisces is also pretty optimistic too in its own way. Same with Jupiter in Cancer is exalted, and Jupiter in Leo is also pretty lucky. There's a lot of luck, a lot of soulfulness. I'm not really sure what else to say, honestly. Having Jupiter exalted, that's a big one for those early soulful autumn subgeneration individuals. Okay, and the last of so there are 3 total subgenerations within the autumn generation. So the third out of the 3, I call them the genius autumn subgeneration. And appropriately, this period starts in February 1980, where the sun happens to be in Aquarius. It actually starts during eclipse season. Anyway, so the genius autumn subgeneration occupies the time period between February 1980 and November 1981. And so this is characterized, of course, the outer planets are still the same. They're still part of the autumn generation with Pluto in Libra, Neptune in Scorpio, Uranus in Sagittarius. The difference here, though, is that Jupiter is now in Virgo, and later within this subgeneration, Jupiter will be in Libra. Saturn is also starting out in Virgo and going through Libra for this subgeneration, and they will conjoin as well. This is extremely powerful, by the way. As a side note, having Jupiter and Saturn conjunct, I could not think of a more constructive conjunction or aspect. Okay, so these people are builders and they're intelligent. Having whether Jupiter and Saturn are in Virgo or Libra, these are both intellectual signs. They're very intellectual placements for this entire subgeneration. This subgeneration, the genius autumn, again, February 1980 through November 1981, they also have South Node in either Aquarius or Capricorn, which are also very intelligent placements either way and very constructive placements as well. So yeah, that is kind of an interesting development. This is so far this is the most intellectual subgeneration that I've covered. There will be more, but yeah, very maybe very detached, I would say. All the generations and subgenerations that we've talked about so far have been a little bit more fantastical, romantic. These people are a little bit more, like I said, detached, intellectual, kind of brainy, cerebral, maybe a little bit more book smart, etc. And that concludes the autumn generation. The next generation is the hopeful. I call them the hopeful generation, or the optimists, the optimistic generation, whatever you want to call it. This generation occupies the period between December 1981 and November 1985. We're now getting into the millennials, in case you were curious. There's different ways of dividing, just like the way I've divided these generations. People can debate on when the Gen X ends and when millennials begin. But basically, I would say this is the first millennial generation. And this, the optimist generation, this occupies 4 years, and I've divided it into 3 sub-generations. And the first of which is the the go-getter optimists, I call them. And this subgeneration occupies the period between December 1981 and October 1983. I'm going to have a sip of my drink because this is a lot. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but we're going to get through it. All right. Go-getter optimists, December 1981, October 1983. So first I should mention the optimist generation is characterized by Uranus in Sagittarius, Neptune in Sagittarius. Pluto will start out in Libra and then be in Scorpio. So really the way I divided this period, it's not actually based on Pluto. It's based on, this generation, again, between very late 1981 to very late 1985. All these people have both Uranus and Neptune in Sagittarius. So this is very powerful. Something I kind of realized as I was researching for this video is that pretty much throughout the entire 80s, there were some kind of placements in Sagittarius, whether it be the South Node, Uranus, Neptune, etc., Jupiter. There's some kind of outer planets in Sagittarius. So this is why the 80s are such a hopeful generation, such a hopeful period as well. There are also a lot of placements that go through Scorpio that we'll talk about later. So there is also this kind of like doomsday element to Scorpio, to the 1980s. Back, I wasn't alive then, but from what I've gathered, there was this element of we could die at any minute. There was this threat of Cold War, nuclear war, etc. But at the same time, it was a party generation. There was a lot of cocaine, going around the United States anyway. So yeah, it's easy to see in the astrology. I do believe Sagittarius is the most optimistic sign. So there's this combination in the 80s of a lot of Sagittarius, but also definitely some Scorpio as well. So that, again, that kind of gives you an idea. And again, you can relate it to the seasons. This is like fall. Think about what does it feel like as I'm making this video, we're going through Scorpio season and we're about to enter Sagittarius. So the vibes around this time of year are intense. They're very passionate, emotional. That's the same energy, kind of on a different way of experiencing it. We're comparing the short term with the long term, but the energy we experience every year around this time of year is very similar to what was experienced in a more long-term sense throughout the 1980s. Okay, so I know that was a side. We got sidetracked there, but I do think that's important to talk about. Okay, so let's get back. The hopeful generation, the optimists, Uranus and Neptune both in Sagittarius. Very powerful, very optimistic. The first of the three is the go-getter optimists, and in addition to having Uranus and Neptune in Sagittarius, Pluto's still in Libra. This is the last subgeneration to have Pluto in Libra, by the way. But this subgeneration also has Chiron in Taurus / early Gemini, Saturn in Libra and Scorpio, Jupiter in Scorpio and Sagittarius, and South Node in Capricorn and Sagittarius. So the reason why I call them the go-getter optimists is because no matter where people are born during this period, they will either have Jupiter in Scorpio or Sagittarius. So these are very different placements, but they're both very passionate. There's a lot of energy here, passion. They want to go all the way. Whether you have Jupiter in Scorpio or Sagittarius, these are extreme placements. These people are extremely passionate. Whatever they do, they're going to put their heart and their soul into. So especially when you combine that dynamic with South Node in Capricorn and or Sagittarius, this seems like, to me, it seems like a very extreme subgeneration. I call them the go-getters because whatever they want, they're going to go get it. They're going to go all the way. They're going to be the one that outperforms everyone else, that takes things to another level that, other people that are too vanilla or whatever, or inhibited, they might not be willing to go to that level. But these go-getter optimists, there's that extremeness of Jupiter in Scorpio or Sagittarius and South Node in Capricorn or Sagittarius. Again, a lot of Sagittarius placements, and believe it or not, that will actually increase with the next subgeneration. The next subgeneration occupies the period between November 1983 and September 1984. Look at that Sagittarius stellium. We have, of course, we're generally ignoring the inner placements throughout this video, but look specifically at the beginning of this subgeneration for November 1983. There's Mercury, Uranus, Jupiter, South Node, and Neptune all in Sagittarius. So of those placements, only Mercury is like an inner solar system placement. All the other ones, Uranus, Jupiter, South Node, and Neptune, are definitely on our radar. So huge stellium. And yeah, even throughout this entire subgeneration, I call them the Sagittarius subgeneration, the Sagittarian optimists, because they all have not only Uranus and Neptune in Sagittarius, but also Jupiter in Sagittarius and early Capricorn, and then South Node in Sagittarius as well. Tons of Sagittarius. You're not going to find a different generation or subgeneration with more Sagittarius placements, or Sagittarius outer placements. So yeah, really the themes of this generation are mostly focused on Sagittarius. They're very optimistic, very hopeful, maybe to a fault. They have a combination of being very passionate and very emotional, as well as very intellectual as well. Really this all just goes back to Sagittarius. There are two outer placements, outer planets in Scorpio though, that add a different kind of energy. This is the first subgeneration that has Pluto in Scorpio. You can see November 1983, Pluto has just recently entered Scorpio. Even though that's not the most dominant factor here for this subgeneration, this is what made me divide. This is what went into me beginning this generation at this particular time, if that makes sense. It's what separates this subgeneration from the previous one. It's what separates the Sagittarius optimist from the go-getter optimist. So I know that's a little bit confusing, but they have so many Sagittarius placements, that's the dominant energy. But Pluto and Saturn are both in Scorpio. And so what we see kind of happening is that there's actually an increasing focus on Scorpio, and we'll see that even more in the next subgeneration. So again, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. These people were born at a time that was very hopeful, very optimistic, but there was also this element of like doom in the background from Pluto and Saturn in Scorpio. And again, that's what we experience every year, kind of around the holidays. Super cheerful, optimistic, everything's so great, parties, holidays, yet at the same time, everything's dying around us, right? That's a great kind of analogy. It's the same energy. We can see these cycles everywhere. But yeah, that because these people were born at that time, that's what their character is. That's what their energy is for their entire lives. There's a lot going on here. With both Scorpio and Sagittarius, there's this combination of being very passionate, but also very logical, very analytical. So this is a very intelligent subgeneration, but very emotional as well, very passionate. And I could see them being very skilled at all sorts of things. They could be really cerebral, or they could be very athletic. It kind of just depends on the individual and what other specific placements they have. But whatever they do, the common theme is they're going to take it to an extreme, right? Kind of similar to what I talked about with the previous subgeneration. It is similar. These people are going above and beyond. They're outperforming. They're going to take, what's the normal way of doing it? Okay, I'm going to do that times 2, times 10. The Scorpio and Sagittarius are both very extreme. My pointer is working. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, the last of the three, the third of the three subgenerations that fall within the hopeful or optimistic generation. This is I call them the troubled generation, or excuse me, technically I'm still learning these terms that I just invented myself. The troubled subgeneration. So in other words, the troubled optimists, which I know that's a little bit of a catch-22, or a what's the word for old news, jumbo shrimp. It's an oxymoron. The troubled optimists. This is really true though, and these are themes that I've already kind of discussed a little bit, but they really culminate with this subgeneration. This subgeneration has a really interesting combination of, they still have a lot of Sagittarius placements going on, but there's a lot of Scorpio as well. And I wanted to make a side note, because this is actually the first subgeneration that I really noticed the pattern of their astrology. And honestly, this is the subgeneration that inspired me to make this video. And the reason why is because they all have South Node, Saturn, and Pluto in Scorpio. This is extremely difficult, and that's why I call them the troubled subgeneration, or the troubled optimists. They're still optimistic. They still have Uranus and Neptune and Sagittarius. They're still born during a very optimistic time. But having Pluto, Saturn, and the South Node. Pluto and Saturn are both malefics. Wherever they are in a chart, it indicates a troubled, a difficult area for a person. So having both of them in the same sign, that indicates for these people, they have huge karma. There's a huge heaviness with Scorpio themes, with sex, with intimacy, with money, with shared resources. These people are going to really struggle with these things, especially at a young age. And because South Node, Saturn, and Pluto are all three in the same sign, which I know I keep saying that, but it's a big deal. South Node indicates past life karma, past life, history. So basically what I'm getting at is not only do these people struggle, particularly at a young age, with sex, intimacy, sovereignty, manipulation, money, shared resources, etc., they've likely struggled with these issues in past lives. And because we have such slow, heavy planets like Saturn and Pluto here, this may take decades for these people to work out. Most people generally work through much of their kind of Saturn themes in their 20s, their 30s, etc. But adding in Pluto, adding in the South Node, this is very difficult. Many of these people will never break through their patterns, their struggles with scorpionic themes. And if you are part of the subgeneration, I don't want you to feel like it's not worth it or like you can't rise above this, because you can. There are so many abilities and so much power, so much awareness that comes from Scorpio placements, okay? But it's not going to be easy. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is a rough, it's a difficult. I was thinking today, we're all dealt a hand. We're dealt cards, right? In a game, in life. Sometimes we're dealt a rough hand. This looks like a rough hand to me. But you can still, if you know the game, you can still come out on top. You can still win, even if you're dealt a rough hand. You just have to know the game, right? So you are intelligent. You're extremely passionate. You have a lot of abilities. It's going to be difficult, though, to break through whatever your specific trauma is, because there is trauma that comes. We all generally have trauma, especially with these placements, though. There's some heavy trauma here. It comes from your past lives. You can work through this, though, but it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of dedication. Okay, and that concludes the hopeful generation. Quite literally. Yes, it does. Okay. So next, this is a little bit different. This is what I call the changeover generation. This is a very short one, so you can either view it as a generation or a subgeneration. It's kind of like it's transitional. It's in between. This occupies the period between November 1985 and November 1987, and this is a period where the outer planets are changing. So that's this whole generation or subgeneration, whatever. These people are a catalyst. They're in between these phases. This is a very transitional part of the millennial generation. I don't know how else to say it. They still have Pluto in Scorpio, which will continue. Uranus is still in Sagittarius, but now Neptune is in Capricorn. And just kind of to give you a sneak peek, the next generation will have Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn. So basically, okay, to put it, I'm going to try to simplify this. So between November 1985 and November 1987, we're basically kind of transitioning between that fall I was talking about, and we're starting to get more toward winter with some of these outer planets beginning to enter Capricorn. Pluto will still be in Scorpio, which is of course a fall sign, but if you're starting to have one and then soon to be two outer planets in Capricorn, which is a winter sign, and Pluto's still in Scorpio, we're starting to get into much colder vibes. I hope you understand the themes. Fall is a much more, it's focused on socializing. It's very intellectual, but it's also about relationships. We're learning a lot about society during these fall signs. As we begin to enter like global winter, which I know that sounds weird because of global warming and stuff like that, but on an astrological level, we're entering this kind of global winter. What I mean by that is these winter signs of Capricorn, and eventually we'll get to the outer planets in Aquarius, Pisces, etc. These are more focused on the world. They become much more dreamy, much more holistic, much more stoic as well, much less romantic. Fall is more of kind of a party vibe, all about socializing and things like that. Things become a little bit more serious in winter, and that's why that's why I call it winter. That, I'm not the first person to come up with that. We experience that every winter. Things do become more stoic, maybe a little bit more serious, more kind of dry, I guess, depending on your latitude and climate or whatever. But on a thematic level, I hope that makes sense. I guess it's still about society, but in a more kind of global sense. Fall is more about like local customs, and I hope I'm making sense. It's hard for me to, you probably already know this channel is more focused on advanced astrology. I do some kind of like fun videos as well, but I'm not going to have enough time to explain all the basics here. So I hope you guys are smart. I'm sure you get it. I hope you get it. Anyway, this changeover, this transitional generation, they're in this weird, they still have some positive, like romantic-ish vibes because of Neptune Uranus still being in Sagittarius, but Neptune is now in Capricorn. So things are starting to get serious here. Things are starting to get colder, literally, kind of, these people are starting to become a little bit colder, more stoic, more resilient, because of, the combination of Pluto and Scorpio with Neptune now freshly in Capricorn. There's a lot of resilience here. There's a lot of industriousness, and that's only going to continue with the next subgeneration. So less of a party vibe, more independent, resilient, stoic, etc. Huge change that's going on here, as I've hopefully alluded to. Saturn is in Sagittarius here, which is challenging. These people are going to start life not being open to new ideas or ideas that are different from the culture that they kind of grow up in, but they will generally overcome that in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. Jupiter will transit through Aquarius, Pisces, and Aries, so those are some pretty dreamy and pretty powerful Jupiter placements. But yeah, like, I don't know, it's a transition. I don't know how else to say it. This entire little generation is in between generations. That's the best way I can put it. South Node will go through Scorpio and Libra. So yeah, depending on how you kind of dice it, these people, they have a lot of fall vibes. They have a lot of winter vibes. They're in between, and that may make actually more sense as I talk about this next generation. So the next generation, I call them the powerhouse generation, and they occupy the period between February 1988 and November 1995. This is the last generation that has Pluto in Scorpio. So this does, many of you listening will fall into this generation. This is the generation that I fall into as well. And this generation is characterized by Uranus and Neptune both being in Capricorn with Pluto in Scorpio. If you're listening to this and you're part of this generation, you were dealt a rough hand. In a way, it's a little bit similar to the troubled subgeneration between late 84 and late 85. In a way, it's a little bit similar, because it's different placements, but there is a focus on Scorpio, but now Capricorn as well. I would go as far as to say that Scorpio and Capricorn I would say that they're the most difficult signs in the zodiac. Okay. There's some of the later yin signs. Pisces is probably up there as well, and Virgo. But I would say Scorpio and Capricorn maybe even more so for being the most difficult signs. So having a whole generation with outer planets in those signs, these people are going to be troubled. But I call them the powerhouse generation because these signs are incredibly resilient. They're incredibly hardworking. This age group kind of matures and becomes adults, in the time after the 2008 recession. So, at this point in time, this generation has had to work very hard to get kind of anything. But anyway, so this generation, let me look through my notes real quick. I'm so sorry. I did my best to be prepared for this. This powerhouse generation, like I said, occupies the period between February 88 and November 95. And that is 7 years, and I've divided it into 4 subgenerations. The first subgeneration within the powerhouse generation is the intellectual splits. What did I name them? Oh, okay, yeah. So I call them the worker powerhouse subgeneration, which I know is a little bit lame, but The reason why is because, in addition to having Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn with Pluto and Scorpio, they also have South Node in Virgo and Leo. So there's a lot of industriousness here. One small side note, Uranus will retrograde into, or it did retrograde into Sagittarius for this subgeneration. So there's a minority of people out there that have Uranus still in Sagittarius. Generally speaking, Uranus is mostly in Capricorn here, so that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay, so these people have South Node in Virgo and Leo. Jupiter will go through Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer. It's kind of all over the place. Saturn is mostly in Capricorn, but also Sagittarius. So it's kind of a lot going on, but the main focus here, I would say, between Saturn in Capricorn and South Node in Virgo, these people are workers, especially combining those placements with Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn, Pluto and Scorpio. This might be the hardest working generation, or subgeneration, I should say, technically. Yeah, I don't know how else to say it. They're hard workers. They've had to work very hard. They're industrious. Many of them will be the boss. Many of them will be the worker. Either way, they're working. They're being productive. South Node and Leo. So for the last part of this subgeneration, they will have South Node and Leo, so they'll be very confident. But there's still a lot of really heavy energy focused around this subgeneration. So even those of you that are born with South Node in Leo, you do have that confidence and that warmth to you, but you're still a very heavy, very intense kind of subgeneration as a whole. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so the first of the 4 subgenerations within the powerhouse generation was the worker subgeneration. The second subgeneration we're going to talk about is the deep feelers. So the deep feeler powerhouse generation. This occupies the period between December 1990 and June 1992. Look at that Capricorn stellium. That is, as an astrologer, whenever I see something like that, I'm just like, I get like an astrologer boner, I guess you could say. That's intense. There's a lot going on there. Are there some inner planetary placements there? Sure. But there's a lot of outer planetary stuff there as well. Venus, Uranus, Mercury, Neptune, Saturn, and the North Node all in Capricorn. Big deal. All kind of opposing South Node and Chiron in Cancer. Big deal here. Okay, so the deep feelers, of course, because they're part of the powerhouse generation, they still have Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn, with Pluto and Scorpio. They're born, though, with Uranus and Neptune. Many of them have Uranus and Neptune conjunct, which is very historic. It's a very big deal. Whenever, 2 outer planets that are that far out, that are that slow, very rare that they conjoin. So these people are going to kind of reinvent the world. They're going to reinvent kind of the structure of society. Big deal. Big deal there. But specifically, this subgeneration also has South Node in Cancer, which is kind of why I gave them that name of the deep feelers. They feel very deeply, and I think many of them are going to feel like society is kind of against them. Maybe that's why they end up reinventing society, because these are more difficult placements. Having South Node in Cancer, part of them wants to be like the baby. They want to be the soft one. They want to be emotionally vulnerable. Yet at the same time, they're conflicted because they have so many placements in Capricorn saying, you have to be tough, you have to be serious, you have to go out there and make a name for yourself, be your own person. They're conflicted between the two. It's going to be very difficult for them to, depending on how you look at it, it may be very difficult for them to branch out and evolve, but many of them will be successful in doing so. Generally, having planets around your North Node actually does make it easier for you to evolve. So even though I can see how this might be extremely difficult for some people, it can also be a natural progression for others. But it just depends on how you look at it. Having so many placements in Capricorn, like I mentioned, I would say Capricorn is one of the hardest signs to have placements in. So this subgeneration grows up. Many of them will be very isolated at a young age. They'll be very alone, very sensitive, very emotional, but very alone. They have to be stoic. They have to be tough. And yeah, it's another a difficult hand, a bad hand. But there is so much potential here. That's a huge keyword for this subgeneration. They grew up under very difficult circumstances, but they have potential to do something very major. And what that is very much depends on the individual. Capricorn is a very individualistic sign. So, specifically what that looks like for each person is going to vary dramatically for that person. But it's all about individual goals. If you have these placements yourself, if you're born within this time period, what do you want personally? I know that sounds really vague, but there's a lot of power. There's so much power and potential in that for you. This isn't like, okay, well, I don't want to skip around because I don't want to get lost because I have a lot of tabs open. But I mean, compare that to, some of these earlier generations that have so much like Libra and Sagittarius. It was a much more social orientation, more like party vibes, as I said. This is completely different. These people are on their own. They have to figure stuff out for themselves. It really makes sense that we see, people becoming less social with these generations. Imagine having these many placements in Capricorn. This is a very independent sign, more of an introverted sign. So it all makes sense. But yeah, Jupiter will go through Leo and Virgo for these people as well. So it's actually the beginning part of this subgeneration that is very confident, very outgoing with Jupiter in Leo. For the last part, Jupiter in Virgo, that's going to be even more difficult, very, very difficult, because all these outer planets are lining up in mostly Capricorn, and then, like I said, some of them will have Jupiter in Virgo. Very tough, very difficult, specifically with those of you that have Jupiter in detriment. But like I said, that is, we want things to be easy, but the hardest placements that are in astrology also have the most potential. Okay. So, I do believe you chose this on a soul level. You wanted this. So even though it might suck going through it and you might have a lot of trauma, think about, on a soul level. I'm sure you've probably thought of this. Why would I choose this on a soul level? Like, what am I meant to do or to learn? And I bet you it's something very powerful, something that I probably don't even understand because it's up to you. It's all about you. Okay, for I believe the third subgeneration of these four, for the powerhouse generation, this is the one that I happen to be a part of, and this is I call them the intellectual powerhouse subgeneration. So they of course still have Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn with Pluto in Scorpio, so still born under very difficult kind of circumstances. They're very independent, very resilient, powerhouse generation. These are workers. This continues to be true. What's kind of differentiating this specific subgeneration is that they have South Node in Gemini with Jupiter in Virgo for the earlier ones and Jupiter in Libra for the later ones. Also, Saturn is now firmly in Aquarius too. So combining, Gemini, Virgo / Libra, and then Aquarius, these are all very cerebral, detached, intellectual signs. This is, very, this is one of the two most intellectual subgenerations that we've talked about here. So yeah, very hard workers, very independent, but also very analytical too. There's some air here, not for the broader generation, but for the specific subgeneration. There are some major air placements. So these are thinkers. They're thinking a lot. This obviously I very much align with these themes. But yeah, for the rest of the subgeneration as well, I could see them being very humble as well. That would be also true for the last couple. Especially for the deep feelers and for the intellectual deep feeler powerhouse, intellectual powerhouse. These are very humble subgenerations, I would say. What else? With this new air kind of dynamic, I would say the intellectual powerhouse subgeneration wants to conform, but may feel awkward in doing so. They don't really know their place. With Saturn and Aquarius, many of these people have social anxiety, awkwardness. They may not like groups, especially at a young age. It takes them time to learn where they fit in with society, but they do have the potential for being leaders in groups, especially later in life. And we're still seeing that. I'm 31, so people of this subgeneration are in their early 30s, something like that. So they're still evolving. They still, obviously everyone kind of grows at different rates. But because of the timing of Saturn, it may still, these people may be becoming leaders in groups at this time, or they may do so in the next 10 or 20 years. but we'll really see that as we kind of go forward here. Okay, and the last subgeneration within the powerhouse generation, I call them the individualist powerhouse subgeneration. And this period occupies the time between January 1994 and November 1995. So they, of course, still have Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn, Pluto in Scorpio. But many of these kind of relatively faster placements have changed signs. Chiron is now firmly in Virgo. Saturn's in Pisces for these individuals. Jupiter is in Scorpio and Sagittarius, and South Node is in Taurus and Aries. So specifically, I try to come up with names that kind of encapsulate the themes of all these different placements. But the reason why I say they're individualists, well, first of all, the entire powerhouse generation is a very individualist generation. But specifically these people, 1994, 1995, having South Node in Taurus or Aries, it's a very individualist placement either way. These people are very self-aware, self-focused on what they want, their own intentions, their own desires, their own boundaries, etc. And with Jupiter in Scorpio / Sagittarius, there's a lot of passion here as well. These people know what they want and they know how to get what they want. I think there's a lot more like solidarity or like solidness with these individuals compared to the last couple subgenerations that we talked about are a little bit more conflicted. They're more like deep into their own thoughts and feelings and stuff like that. These people here are much more like actualized. They're much more like physical, like literally oriented, if that makes sense. Much more action oriented. So yeah, individualist powerhouse, whatever you want to call it. That's what I came up with. Okay, so that ends the powerhouse generation. The next generation that I talk about is the nonconformist generation. And this occupies the period between December 1995 and March of 2003. So here we have Pluto in Sagittarius. So this is the first generation with Pluto in Sagittarius. The first of two generations with Pluto in Sagittarius. This stuff is all really complicated. I'll make it into like a chart or a table for you that I'll probably make it the thumbnail. So Pluto in Sagittarius for the nonconformists. And Uranus and Neptune will start out in Capricorn and they'll eventually go to Aquarius. That gets a little bit complicated here because both Uranus and Neptune will retrograde. They'll go back and forth between Capricorn and Aquarius. So generally speaking, the nonconformist, late 95 to early 2003, Uranus and Neptune, Capricorn / Aquarius, Pluto, Sagittarius. Hopefully that makes sense. So the first subgeneration within the nonconformist generation, I call them the rebel or the bold leader nonconformists. And this subgeneration occupies the period between December 1995 and February 1997. So here you can see a lot of Capricorn still, especially specifically for this month that begins this whole subgeneration. But there's a huge difference with this subgeneration. That's why they're initiating an entirely new generation, because Pluto, Uranus, Chiron, Saturn, Jupiter, and the South Node and the North Node as well, they're all changing signs either at the beginning of this subgeneration or in its duration, if that makes sense. So a lot changing. In other words, there's a huge shift that happens in the mid-90s. We're basically starting to shift between the last of the millennials and the first of the Gen Zers. And again, that cutoff kind of just depends. You could still group all the rebel nonconformists in the millennials if you wanted to, or you could say some of them are starting to, there's a huge difference here, specifically with Pluto in Sagittarius. Most millennials have Pluto in Scorpio, so they're much more, it's kind of a darker generation, very independent, hardworking, emotional, but also very analytical as well. Many of them are also rebels, if that makes sense. They're kind of like, very opinionated about society and things like that. So that kind of changes as we get into this generation with Pluto now in Sagittarius. These people are much more outspoken, much more rebellious. They're it's hard to put into words, but most of the millennials are a little bit more willing to like at least pretend to conform. They may still have different ideas and be rebellious in their own way, but it's more of like a focused kind of introverted scorpionic way. With Pluto and Sagittarius, it's much more tactless. Here I am, this is what I'm doing, I don't care if it fits into your boxes, like this is how it is. It's much more just out there and kind of sloppy, but also it has its place, it has its time. I personally admire these energies. So yeah, that's what we're getting into now. Depending on this, where you fall within this subgeneration, you will either have Uranus in Capricorn or Aquarius. Saturn is in Aries, though, for this subgeneration. So these people will start out having very high standards for themselves. They may be very depressed, very hard on themselves, but they have the potential for having a very strong kind of sense of self, especially later in life. This is especially true because depending on where they fall, they'll either have Jupiter in Sagittarius, Capricorn, or Aquarius. So either way, they'll be very skilled when it comes to operating within society, putting themselves out there, making a name for themselves. There's a lot of ambition here, I would say. And with South Node in Aries as well, that's really where you get this rebellious. There's a lot of karma with Aries for this subgeneration. This is really an Aries subgeneration. They're really starting something new. And that's why they're nonconformists. That's the whole point. But yeah, South Node and Saturn and Aries, especially later in life, these people are really going to change things in a dramatic way. And that really applies to every part of life. It's not a specific area that they're changing. It's everything. They're starting new things. They're doing different things. They're very spontaneous. This is the most fiery subgeneration that I've talked about in decades. Much of the late 80s and early 90s has been very heavy, very scorpionic, very Capricornian. Now we get some fire, we get some warmth, we get some enthusiasm. Things are becoming more bold, more rebellious. That's the best way I can put it. The next subgeneration that falls within the nonconformists is, I call them the imaginative or the self-undoing subgeneration, or the name I think I was going to settle on is the loner nonconformists, which is a little bit redundant, but that's because their astrology is kind of redundant. There's a lot of Aquarius that starts kind of popping up now. These people have Pluto, of course, is still in Sagittarius. Uranus is now firmly in Aquarius, and then now Neptune is starting to enter Aquarius. And depending on where you're at, Neptune will either be in Capricorn or Aquarius for this subgeneration. And Jupiter will also be in Aquarius for many of these people. So we're starting to see a lot of Aquarius placements for many of these people. So that's why they're loners. People with a lot of Aquarius placements, they're painfully aware of how different they are from everyone else. So that's where many of these people are rebels. Many of these people are like politically involved or very very opinionated, like socially, politically. They might hate groups, and yet at the same time they might be part of groups, like part of rebel groups or different like clubs and things, especially clubs or groups that have to do with like us versus them, like, oh, I don't fit into society, so how can I group into maybe like a smaller group where we can feel like we're a part of something. That's much of the theme that I see kind of going on for these people. The reason why I said this is like the self-undoing loners, or self-undoing nonconformists, the reason why I came up with that name is because South Node is in Pisces for these people. So in addition to being kind of rebellious and very intellectual, very like a loner, having South Node in Pisces, that kind of expands that whole loner theme, and it gives them kind of escapist tendencies as well. So part of their not feeling like they fit in, part of it is valid, part of it is based on objective information, but part of it on a more subtle level is coming from a place of emotion. It's more subjective. Part of them just wants to escape, and that's just how it is. Much of it does have to do with society, but I think on a more subtle level, on a more maybe subconscious level, they will always want to escape. That's just part of their personality. What else can we talk about? Saturn will be either in Aries or early Taurus for these people. So Many of them will continue some of those themes of being very hard on themselves early in life, but supporting their individuality in a very strong way later in life. Okay, let me get some more drink. All right. We're still on the nonconformist. There's a lot of subgenerations that fall under the nonconformist. This is really how we're entering, we're leaving the 1900s and entering the new millennium through these nonconformist generations. So the next one, I call them the Aquarian subgeneration, or the Aquarian nonconformists, which again is kind of redundant, but yeah, and I know that's kind of, it may appear confusing because this last one we talked about starts out in February, so they have tons of Aquarius placements. But the reason why I call this one the Aquarius subgeneration is because, unlike the last one, the loner, imaginative, self-undoing, whatever, I couldn't pick a name. Unlike that last subgeneration, this subgeneration has, they still have Uranus and Neptune in Aquarius, but they also have South Node in Aquarius. And again, like I said in the intro, I give more weight to the South Node than I do any other placement that I've talked about in this video. So because of that, these people, in a weird way, they do continue a lot of the same themes that the last subgeneration did. These people are loners, nonconformists, they don't fit in, they might talk a lot about society and how they don't fit in with society, and yet they want to feel like they're a part of something. They might hate groups, and yet at the same time they want to be like an antisocial social club. I don't know if you've seen those t-shirts. It's kind of a joke, but that's what it makes me think of. These people want to be part of a group, like a group against groups, like a group about we're so different from society, and that's natural. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm belittling that concept. It's not a joke. It's valid. That these are all just cycles of nature, of consciousness. But anyway, this continues to be. There's a lot of very dreamy vibes that start kind of going on. Here. I think it really started with the nonconformists in general, because they don't just have a lot of Aquarius placements, but the Aquarian subgeneration will also have Jupiter in either Pisces, Aries, or Taurus, and Saturn in either Taurus or it will retrograde back into late Aries for some of these individuals. But still, the main kind of characteristic of this subgeneration is that South Node in Aquarius, which, so these people they're genius, they're different, they're weird, they're quirky, they don't fit in. Much of their life themes are about learning, do I fit in with society? Can I fit in? If so, what's my role? What's my job? What's my personality? Not just on an individual level, but how does that relate to the collective? That's the struggle here. Part of the challenge, and some of what I'm saying applies to the nonconformists in general, but specifically with this subgeneration, the challenge is learning, if I'm so different from everyone else, it's easy to say, oh, well, I must be either better than everyone else or worse than everyone else. So there's many people start out with either superiority complexes or inferiority complexes. But the ultimate answer is, no, neither of those is really true. We're all different in our own way. We're all unique. That doesn't make us better or worse. We're just different. We're all yeah, you might be different and weird, but we're all weird in our own way, and we have different strengths. And that's the lesson of Aquarius. That's the lesson of these Aquarius placements, and that's the lesson of this subgeneration, and to an extent this entire generation as a whole as well. Okay, and the next subgeneration, this is the first one that starts out in the new millennium, still nonconformist, but I call them the builder nonconformists or the communicator nonconformists. And the reason why is because this subgeneration is actually characterized by South Node in Capricorn with the combination of Jupiter and Saturn in Taurus and later Gemini. Okay, so I know I just threw a lot of lingo at you. South Node in Capricorn means these people are naturally business oriented. They're industrious, they're hardworking. They still are outcast to an extent because of Uranus and Neptune in Aquarius and Pluto in Sagittarius. They still have that kind of rebellious background theme to the entire generation that's been going on for many years by this point. But on a more specific level, South Node and Capricorn, it's like they're simultaneously rebels and outcasts, but they also know how to work with society. Like in a capitalist society, they know how to be leaders, how to be workers, more so than these last couple subgenerations that I talked about. And this is especially true with Jupiter and Saturn in Taurus for the first part. That's why I say they're builders. It's almost like this subgeneration is kind of like slightly split in two, but I couldn't split it into two because Jupiter and Saturn weren't moving exactly together. They're retrograding and things like that. So you might have a combination of, oh, I'm in this subgeneration and I have Jupiter in Taurus and Saturn in Gemini, or vice versa. There's different combinations that played out. It wasn't neat. But whatever they were, you're either a builder or a communicator or both. These are really constructive energies that kind of pop up for this specific subgeneration. It's kind of just focused on, these people are focused on supporting themselves, but also like branching out and exploring other people as well. I know that sounds vague, but that's, if you know these people, or if you are one of these people, you'll I would suspect you'll understand what I'm saying. Okay, the next subgeneration that falls, this is the last of the nonconformist subgenerations. I call them the explorer nonconformists. Okay, kind of a cool name, right? Uranus and Neptune are in Aquarius, and Pluto is in Sagittarius. That has been true. It continues to be true. The difference with these people, they have South Node in Sagittarius rather than Capricorn, and Jupiter will either be in Cancer or Leo, just depending on exactly where you fall. So either way, South Node in Sagittarius are very adventurous. Jupiter exalted in Cancer, and then later still pretty strong in Leo. That's why I say these people are very adventurous. They're going to enjoy, I actually have a brother that is part of this subgeneration, but he loves like super, like ridiculously long road trips, like 3-month long road trips around the entire country. That's just obviously one example, but it just perfectly fits with these placements that we're talking about. But yeah, Saturn is in Gemini, so these people will struggle with like relating to others at a young age. I'm not just talking about any one person. This applies to the entire generation. But yeah, at a young age, these people will have trouble either making friends, communicating, things like that. But they can become masters at a later age. That's how Saturn works. But again, the main theme is very adventurous. They want to push things to the next level. They are very optimistic, very idealistic as well. That's not just because they're currently young. That's part of their personality. They're very idealistic, very hopeful, very adventurous. Yeah. It's kind of straightforward, really. Okay, so that ends the nonconformists. And next, I mentioned some kind of dreamy energies coming up. Next, I call them the dreamer generation. These people are born between May of 2003 and November of 2008. This is the last generation that I will talk about in this video. These people have Uranus in Pisces, Neptune in Aquarius, with Pluto in Sagittarius. Okay, so that's why I call them the dreamer generation. Combining Pisces, Aquarius, and Sagittarius all in one generation. These are very dreamy energies, right? Very worldly, and there's a combination of being very intellectual, but also very passionate, sensitive, spiritual. There's almost like a spiritual revival that kind of comes from, Uranus entering Pisces for these people. These people maybe, as a generation, I think this is the most kind of like spiritually oriented generation since, since maybe some of these 80s and 90s generations, I guess, that had those like Scorpio placements. We're seeing more water again with Uranus in Pisces. Okay, so that's the general focus between May 2003 to November 2008. But I've divided this generation into 3 subgenerations. The first of the 3 subgenerations, I call them the balanced dreamers. Kind of a lame name. It's the best I could come up with. But the reason why is because their placements are pretty balanced. The only thing I could kind of nitpick is that there is a lack of Earth when it comes to these outer planetary placements. Those of you that are born in this time period that have other like Earth, Sun, Earth, Moon, whatever, you'll be especially balanced because, like I said, that's the only thing that's lacking on a generational level. Chiron is in Capricorn. That is one Earth placement. But anyway, the reason why I said it's a balanced subgeneration is because there's, other than maybe Earth, there's a balance of the elements. You know, if you have 3 elements roughly balanced, that's a pretty balanced chart. Okay. So where am I getting this from? It's, you know, South Node is in Scorpio, water. Jupiter is in Leo or Virgo, so that's fire or earth. Saturn is in Gemini or Cancer, so that's air or water. Chiron is in Capricorn, earth, like I mentioned. Uranus is in Pisces, which is water. Neptune is in Aquarius, which is air. Pluto is in Sagittarius, which is fire. Yeah, now that I look at it, I guess fire and earth are actually kind of on equal footing. But the point is, the placements are actually a little bit scattered at this point. You know, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto are all about one sign away. And if you include Capricorn, it's actually pretty neat. You know, South Node, well, even the South Node as well. South Node, Scorpio, Pluto, Sagittarius, Chiron, Capricorn, Neptune, Aquarius, Uranus, Pisces. Do you see what I'm saying? Like there's one generational placement in like each of these signs, like one by one, side by side. So that's very neat, very balanced. Yeah, it honestly, it makes it more difficult for me to analyze on an astrological level because there's more of a mix of things going on. That's why it makes a more balanced person or a balanced subgeneration. These people actually, and I spoke. I spoke correctly. Never mind. Yeah, these people are passionate because of South Node in Scorpio, Pluto in Sagittarius. They're also intellectual because of Neptune in Aquarius. They're also dreamy and spiritual because of Uranus in Pisces. You know, depending on their like more individualistic kind of placements, their personal placements, those will kind of skew their charts in completely different directions. You know, like for instance, if you have Sun and Moon in Pisces with Uranus in Pisces, they're going to more explore that part of their generational astrology. It just kind of, it really depends with this particular subgeneration. Yeah, the only pattern I could see is that there is more activity in kind of the later signs. You know, like I mentioned, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. These are all the last signs. But that's true for kind of all of these generations generally. So, yeah, I hope I said enough on that, but that's all I could come up with. Okay, next subgeneration, November 2004 through June 2006. I call them the selfless dreamers or the diplomat dreamers. And the reason why is because these people have South Node in Libra, Jupiter in Libra, and potentially for some of these later individuals, they may have Jupiter in Scorpio as well. So either way, this is a little bit different. This is actually a little bit reminiscent of people born like more like in the 70s, because this is the most diplomatic generational astrology I've seen, you know, in a long time for many generations that we've talked about. You know, with Uranus and Pisces, Neptune, Aquarius, Pluto, Sagittarius, they're still part of this like generally like dreamer or rebellious, you know, background or long-term pattern. But adding those quicker placements of South Node in Libra, Jupiter, Libra / Scorpio, they have a little bit more societal awareness, more like relationship awareness. You know, they know kind of the social, they're more socially inclined, more socially focused. There's more of a social intelligence. So rather than just saying, oh, I'm just going to be on my own and be a total rebel, they may have that, but they're also aware of like, how do I get along with people? How do I conform to some extent? You know what I mean? So I do think that's a very powerful dynamic. This is challenging. These people are challenged though at a young age, in a dramatic way, because they have Saturn in Cancer and or Leo. Well, not and or. They have Saturn in either Cancer or Leo. Either way, Saturn is in detriment. It's debilitated for these people. So they start out kind of feeling like their pride is injured at a young age, feeling like they don't have a family, they don't have that support on like an emotional, like prideful level. So they start out feeling kind of alone. It may take them many years to build their own family, build their own pride, etc. But like I said, they have a lot of different tools at their disposal. I think this looks like a very talented subgeneration, and they still are very balanced, a little bit reminiscent of the last subgeneration that I talked about, but more, like I said, more socially intelligent, I would say, socially focused. Okay, and the last subgeneration of the dreamer generation, as well as the last subgeneration that we're going to talk about in this video, I call them the last dreamers, excuse me, because it's quite literally, basically the reason why I stopped here. Well, I should mention this subgeneration is born between June 2006 and November 2008. This is the last subgeneration born with Pluto in Sagittarius. You know, Pluto is the last of the people born with Pluto in a fall sign. So yeah, there's a huge transition that occurs at the end of this subgeneration. But before, we don't need to talk about that right now. Let's talk about this actual subgeneration, the last dreamers, before the very rough and very stoic energy of Pluto and Capricorn that will follow. But anyway, these people have, of course, they continue to have Uranus in Pisces, Neptune in Aquarius, Pluto in Sagittarius, but they also have Saturn in Leo or Virgo. Chiron it has been in Aquarius. It entered Aquarius during the last subgeneration. Jupiter is in Scorpio or Sagittarius or Capricorn for these people, and South Node in Virgo or Leo. So again, it's kind of a more balanced dynamic. I think there's a lot of ambition here, a lot of power to these people, and there are like multiple different combinations here. Many of these placements are changing a lot at this time. But yeah, South Node, Virgo or Leo, Jupiter, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn. Whatever way you slice it, there's a lot of ambition, a lot of power here. These people know what they want. They have a lot of enthusiasm. They have a lot of passion. And again, they may be very hard on themselves at a young age, but they become very strong, especially as they get older. And and that's it. That's what I got. So I hope I did a good job for you. My intention was to explain what I've learned. I've compiled all of this information recently. And by teaching you, I want to teach myself to know about what the generations are going through, ultimately what individuals are going through on a generational level. That's what it's all about. But yeah, let me know your experience. Do you relate to your generation or your subgeneration? Do you like your name that I gave you or not? I would love to hear all of it. And if you're interested in the personal reading, I always include my information in the description. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.